today our symposium is called Freeing Science Amid Conflicting Values. So we have three wonderful presenters. The first up is Patrick Brown, who's the co-director of Climate and Energy and the Breakthrough Institute at Johns Hopkins University. So get us started.
All right, yeah, thanks. I'm Patrick Brown. I am currently head of climate analytics at Interactive Brokers, and I'm going to be talking at the end about what I'm doing there. But I think what gets me in the door is I do have academic affiliations. For example, I teach in the energy policy and climate program at Johns Hopkins University, a class called The Science of Climate Change and Its Impact. But I'm primarily talking today from the perspective of a publishing climate scientist. And in that context, I'm interested in breaking the social feedback loops that constrain climate science and striving for a better public knowledge generation system, which should garner more public trust. So I'm going to premise this talk on basically four statements. So the first, just to get it out of the way, is that contemporary global warming is unequivocal and is caused 100% by human activities. So it's warmed about 1.5 degrees Celsius since the Industrial Revolution. And over mid-latitude land, that's about 4 degrees Fahrenheit. And you can basically apply that to all temperatures, cold temperatures, hot temperatures. And so today is going to be 100 degrees. And we can think about that would have been about 96 degrees in a pre-industrial climate. And so that is being caused by CO2 accumulating in the atmosphere, mostly from fossil fuel burning. And we think that these emissions, the flux of CO2 into the atmosphere, is plateauing or on the cusp of plateauing. But it does need to reach close to zero in order to halt future warming. But in order to reach zero fast enough to adhere to temperature targets, I'm going to talk about in a second, it would need to be reduced very dramatically, very quickly. So point 3 is that the influence of this warming on local climate and weather extremes tends to be small compared to natural variability and or is overwhelmed by other drivers of change. So I'll give an example of both of those. So small compared to natural variability, this is an example of representation of hurricane activity. So this is represented by counts of hurricanes, tropical storms, hurricanes, major hurricanes. And so if there's a trend in that, it's pretty subtle, so small signal to noise ratio. An example of overwhelmed by other drivers of change would be global wildfire activity. So this is going back to 2002, and we have good data, and is represented here by emissions of carbon into the atmosphere from wildfires. But you get a similar story with area burned from wildfires. And so we see a declining trend in that, and that's not because we think that climate change is not exacerbating wildfire activity. We do think that it is exacerbating wildfire activity. But it's because other drivers, changes in land use, are overwhelming climate change in terms of global wildfire activity. And you see a similar story for basically kind of all extremes. So if you look at floods and droughts and in different metrics, or if you look even at extreme temperatures, if you allow for the cancellation of the decrease in cold extremes to cancel out the increase in heat extremes, or if you look at other types of storms, mid-latitude cyclones, or low pressure systems, the L with the warm front and cold front, severe thunderstorms, so tornadoes, hail, and wind. Those are all very low signal-to-noise ratio type of phenomena in terms of the signal being the influence of increasing greenhouse gas concentrations on those phenomena, and the noise being just natural variability. So then point 4 is that the negative influence of warming on climate-sensitive societal outcomes tends to be completely overwhelmed by technological and economic advances, by changes in society itself. And so I'll just give you some examples of what I'm talking about by climate-sensitive societal outcomes. So food, water, and shelter. I'm using these as icons. I don't expect you to be able to read them, but crop yields since the 1960s are up dramatically across all crops. We've seen an increase in the amount of calories available per person across all regions. We've seen a dramatic decrease in the amount of people that are malnourished, the amount of people that die from famines. When it comes to water, we have an increase in the availability of clean drinking water for people all across the globe, all regions. Shelter, we have a dramatic decline in the fraction of people that die from natural disasters. And health outcomes like malaria, a dramatic decline in the aerial prevalence and the incidence of malaria over the past century, and a decline in even temperature-related heat and cold outcomes. So there's been a dramatic decline in cold-related deaths, partially because it's getting warmer, and so you have less cold-related deaths. But even a decline in heat-related deaths, and that's because technological and economic advances are outpacing changes in climate on that outcome. So access to air conditioning, changes in healthcare, et cetera. So I think there's a problem here, and the problem is that these last 2 points, I think, are highly underrepresented by our knowledge generation system. And I think that that's a problem because, especially this point 4, when this is underrepresented, that means that you're going to divert attention away from proven adaptation solutions. And it's also going to sideline any concerns about the negative effect of overly restrictive energy policies, because this is resulting essentially from fossil-fueled industrialization. So what am I talking about when I say the knowledge system, the knowledge generation system? Well, I'm referring to our scientific journals. So the high-impact journals of Science and Nature are kind of the poster children of that. And then also the downstream of the primary literature are the synthesis reports. So I'm going to talk about the National Climate Assessment here. And so the question is why? Why do these entities underrepresent these points? And so my claim is that researchers are not rewarded for surfacing research results that are aligned with those statements. And instead, they're rewarded for basically signaling membership to the good team. And so what is the good team in terms of climate science? Well, I think the good team is exemplified by international climate diplomacy and international climate laws. So in particular, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which kind of coalesced in the 1980s and then was basically written down in the early 1990s, and every country in the world signed it. And the main goal of the UNFCCC is preventing dangerous human interference with the climate system. And I say it's left-coded because it kind of embeds certain tenets of kind of left-leaning environmental philosophy on kind of pantheistic principles of impacting nature is kind of inherently wrong and self-destructive. And it also embeds global governance and redistribution themes in there. But a central point here is that this policy was enshrined long before the vast majority of research was done, either on climate impacts or on the energy side of things, energy transition side of things. And I think what that has done is it's resulted in decades of, rather than science-based policy, policy-based science. So research done explicitly in service of the existing policy. And so I say that this is solicited, often not so subtly. And so I'll use Science and Nature, the highest level messaging espoused by the leadership of the journals, as examples of that. So this is an example. This is an editorial called The Beyond 2 Degree Inferno, written by editor-in-chief of Science, Marcia McNutt, who's now the president of the National Academy of Sciences. And so this is an explicit endorsement of the international climate policy. Very passionate, uses the word sinners to describe different behavior of humanity. She says, "I wonder where in the 9 circles Dante would place all of us who are borrowing against this earth in the name of economic growth, accumulating an environmental debt by burning fossil fuels." And so my contention is this signals to researchers that there's a good team and that there are more direct paths to publication in science and less direct paths to publication in science. And similarly, on the Nature side of things, Nature has done things like endorse Joe Biden for president in the 2020 election. And one of the main supporting reasons for that is his commitment to the international climate goals, so the Paris Agreement. And similarly, they endorsed Kamala Harris in the 2024 election. Again, one of the reasons being climate policy, and in this case, domestic policy that aligns with international climate goals. So again, I just think that this signals to researchers that there's a more direct path to publication in Nature and Science, and that is to align your research with this good team policy. And I think that distorts the aggregate message of the literature. And sometimes this is rather subtle. So it basically can reorient how researchers ask questions. So rather than ask, what is the magnitude of the influence of climate change and the phenomena I'm studying relative to other relevant influences, researchers are incentivized to ask, how does climate change negatively impact the phenomena I'm studying? And so this distinction is what I wrote about in an essay in the Free Press, where I was critiquing the framing of my own Nature paper on wildfire risk in California. But I think it becomes actually a lot worse than this type of subtle thing, where it seems like a lot of times researchers are asking themselves, how can I frame my research to be optimally useful in support of the good team? And you see that in examples like this, where you're kind of centering the virtue of the policy, of the good team policy, in the title or abstract. Like this one, large potential reduction in economic damages under UN mitigation targets, which, by the way, is an economic benefit-only analysis and not a cost-only analysis, where I would contend that a cost-only analysis would not be publishable, where the benefit-only analysis is. Here's another one, the human imperative of stabilizing global climate change at 1.5 degrees Celsius. If you read the paper, it's just quite clear that it's an assemblage of evidence in favor of this conclusion. And it's not like the researchers were open, it's not some hypothesis test where the researchers were open to an alternative conclusion. And you see kind of straying even further towards signaling membership to the good team now. So now you'll get a lot of papers with like companies or oil majors in the crosshairs. In this case, you have high income groups in the crosshairs. High income groups disproportionately contribute to climate extremes worldwide. Where this paper, they define climate extremes as only heat extremes and not cold extremes. That's completely left out. So presumably a research group could have written a paper that said high income groups disproportionately contribute to a reduction in climate extremes worldwide if they only looked at cold extremes. But of course, that would not get through peer review at Nature Climate Change, but this version does. And I think you see the straying even more when you look at the assessment reports. So I'm just kind of giving you some examples of that. This is a key message from the National Climate Assessment. Systemic racism and discrimination exacerbate climate impacts on human health, where they center results saying, decrease in PSAT scores, hundredths of a standard deviation due to 1 degree hotter year, which I already think is quite dubious, honestly. But then to frame it this way is kind of really, to me, showing kind of an epistemic bubble that the authors are in, that this is, they think, the best messaging. And going even further, this assessment report has an art section with the understanding that together art and science move people to greater understanding and action. So explicitly like an activist document. So there's some problems here. I think overall we have a problem where incentives, there's too much incentives to produce basically signaling rather than incentives to produce the most useful or complete information, which I think is predictive information about the future. You have a lot of unfalsifiable claims, so kind of analysis on the past rather than predictions about the future. And when predictions about the future are made, they're so heavily conditioned that they become practically useless. So it's like under assumption A, B, C, D, E, F, G, we get eye-popping result X. But assumptions A, B, C, D, E, F, G were so important that it becomes practically useless to just kind of assume those away and not have those as part of the dynamics of the problem. And then it's also, in this context, difficult to identify the best information producers. And so I won't belabor this point here, but I think that this has undermined trust in science and universities more so than science. There's an ill-advised solution, I think, going on right now, and that's to use hard censorship, use the government to dismantle science and climate science. So the Trump administration is trying to shut down climate studies via funding mechanisms, shut down climate research institutions, shut down synthesis reports, shut down public-facing websites. So I think that's throwing the baby out with the bathwater and amounts to hard government censorship of free inquiry. But I will offer an alternative solution, and this is not actually what I wrote about in my abstract, but it's what I've been convinced of since then, and it's what I'm working on full time. So hear me out on this, and this is to embrace prediction markets. So I've written about this probably most comprehensively in this article, The Value of Climate Prediction Markets, on IBKR campus. And so what prediction markets do is they essentially allow you to bet on the outcome of future events. And so I'm interested in prediction markets in the environmental space. And the most famous bet in the environmental space was between Paul Ehrlich, who was a professor at Stanford and wrote The Population Bomb, and Julian Simon, who was a professor at Maryland and Illinois and wrote The Ultimate Resource, where Paul Ehrlich was basically saying the Earth has finite resources and population is increasing, and so a large swath of humanity is going to die of starvation. And Julian Simon, The Ultimate Resource, referred to human innovation. And so he was basically saying that no, innovation and substitution will outpace resource depletion, and we won't run out of resources. And so they bet, Simon challenged Ehrlich to the bet, will the price of 5 metals, chromium, copper, nickel, tin, and tungsten, increase or decrease between September 29th, 1980 and September 29th, 1990? And Simon won the bet, so that's a point for human innovation. But that's not the point of bringing this up. The point of bringing this up is that this bet addresses the problems that I just brought up. So incentives to produce signaling rather than being aligned with the most useful, complete information. Well, there's no more direct incentive than having tangible financial skin in the game to put forth your best estimation of reality. Unfalsifiable claims, if you have a bet, you have to have very precise terms and conditions, so that makes the claim falsifiable by definition. And then difficult to identify the best information producers. You don't have to rely on heuristics, say, well, Ehrlich was at the more prestigious university or something like that. You find this out empirically through trial and error of who is successful. And so these betting dynamics are essentially scaled by prediction markets. And so if you've heard of prediction markets, maybe you've heard of them in the context of the last presidential election, where they were shown to do much better than statistical models and polls at predicting that Trump was going to win. But that's just their latest triumph, and they've been around for a long time, and their reasons for success have been studied for a long time. And so the main reason that they're successful is that they're able to tap into the wisdom of the crowds, which is the title of James Surowiecki's 2004 book on this topic. And he points out that crowds, in order for crowds to be wise, the individuals need to be independent, diverse, decentralized. So, viewpoint diversity. This should come as no surprise to anyone at Heterodox Academy. This is like a fundamental pillar of what we're working towards here. And so that's in contrast to the madness of crowds, where crowds become mad when they're too socially connected. You have too much social cohesion within the crowd, and so they're not acting as independent contributors to the knowledge. They're acting as a single entity. And so what these markets do is they aggregate widely dispersed knowledge and distill it into a single probability or price. And this is not something radical and new coming outside of academia. This is something that's been studied academically. They even have their own journal, the Journal of Prediction Markets. They've been studied in the context of climate risk, where this paper concludes the predictions of the markets in climate-related risks were consistent with good reliability, which is a tepid endorsement, but an endorsement nonetheless. And so what I think ultimately what this will do is an embrace of prediction markets will change kind of the orientation of research questions. So rather than a research question being like this, climate change has reduced corn yields by 10% relative to what they would have been without climate change, but retaining all the other benefits of fossil fuels to agriculture over the past 30 years using method X and dataset Y. I would argue that this research conclusion is useful to the researcher, but not very useful to society or to decision makers. And what a prediction market orientation would do is it would make this much more forward-looking. And so the question would just be, what will corn yields be in 2030? And so that could be studied by researchers in terms of, can we make a model that best predicts this, or you could study the efficiency of prediction markets at producing this result. And so overall, I think that this reorients the knowledge generation system around concrete falsifiable questions, which should be a cornerstone of science and is surprisingly lacking a lot of times. Reduces incentives to signal good team membership, which is currently useful to the researcher, and then increases incentives to produce the most useful information for society and decision makers. And so I think that will help break some of these social feedback loops that constrain climate science and get us towards a better public knowledge generation system and hopefully more public trust. Thanks. Okay, I do have time?
Yeah.
Okay, take questions.
I think if you don't interact with all the places on CPAC, CO2 and clean out.
No. No.
What was the question?
He's naming a bunch of what would be called like denier think tanks or organizations. He said that I take it, I don't interact with them, and that's correct. I do not interact with them. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. I'm not familiar with what you're referring to prediction, not previously familiar with it, but presumably the idea is that people are voting and have a stake in the game. And what is that stake? And how does that stake compare to, say, the power of ideologic conviction that, it's all going to get worse in the next 7 years or whatever?
Yeah, well, that's the idea.
Like who when it refers to market, it implies you're making a purchase or a sale.
Yeah, so there's different ways of doing it. So in this case, this is an expert prediction market. So that's, kind of a hybrid, I guess, where you solicit people that you think are experts, and then you give them some type of a financial incentive within that market. And so it's like sometimes you'll have credits to, it's essentially gambling on the outcomes, but it's supposed to align your incentives so that you really want to put forth your best representation of reality. In our prediction markets at Interactive Brokers, it's open to anyone. I'm sympathetic to that because I think, in real financial markets, you've got people that just read the Wall Street Journal. They're not business professors or whatever, and they do really well, and they're contributing very good information to those markets, and that price discovery comes from this widely distributed knowledge. So I'm very reluctant to say, oh, you have to put up gates and only let certain people in, because then we're just getting back to the problems that I'm highlighting in the first place. Yeah.
So I'm new to Heterodox, and I think that this is one of the smartest talks I've heard in a long time. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
I completely agree with the prediction market thing. I'm curious about, and maybe there's not a distinction, but I'm curious about why prediction markets work so well. Is it because collectively people are able to best come up with the right answer, or is it because just the nature of predicting the future is random, and that prediction reflects the randomness of the future outcome? On the last point, what I really like about prediction markets is that they don't skirt the uncertainty, like it's explicit, and the way that these work, they're state price securities where the price of the contract directly represents the probability of the event occurring. And so I think that's really valuable, is that to center that uncertainty there. Why they work, it's this emergent phenomenon that's it's really super interesting. In this book, he talks about after the Columbia disaster, there were 4 companies that could potentially be liable. and the stocks of all of them went down right away, and then immediately 3 of them went up, and the one that stayed down was the one that ended up being liable. And it's like this, just kind of this amazing phenomenon of markets of like, how did that like work? But it's just, you know, it's that people know things and kind of information, the truth kind of comes out when you have the ability to buy and sell the stock type of thing. So it's a very interesting emergent phenomenon. Yeah.
Yeah, on the wisdom of crowds, are there any questions that sort of, because of human evolution and so forth, that they would systematically get the wrong answer, even though they met the conditions of, you know, independence and, you know, the free conditions you mentioned earlier? Or is it just there's somebody in there that pushes it back to the expected value?
Yeah, I mean, the idea is that anytime there's a bias, there's this self-correcting mechanism. There's a huge opportunity to make a bunch of money by exploiting that bias. So you see this in betting markets of sports or whatever. It's like, I think the Lakers are way overvalued because there's so many Laker fans or whatever. Is that you can theoretically exploit that by betting against the Lakers. But it turns out that's really difficult to do because the betting markets are super efficient. And it's really, really, really hard to beat them. So it's this, the same thing is that it seems like when there's enough participants, that's not that big of a problem.
It's not an issue. So virtually any questions will be answered by this method. So
yeah, I'm not going to state that unequivocally, but yeah. I think theoretically, yeah.
Thank you, Patrick. All right. So we're gonna switch to our next presentation, and we have Benjamin Lovett, who will be talking about open science and social responsiveness and conflicting values in psychology, and he's a professor of psychology and education at the Teachers College of Columbia. Ben?
No, thanks very much. I'm very happy to be here, and there are a lot of parallels actually between the ideas that I'll be presenting and Patrick's on climate change. I was a little surprised, but I'm very interested in the different incentives that people have to make claims or to publish certain things. So I'll be talking about 2 different revolutions that I think have taken place in psychology. They go back a ways. You can find ideas that go back a century in either one of them, but in the past 10 years, particularly the past 5 years, both of them have accelerated. One of them is about open science, and the other is about what I'll call social responsiveness. And I'll start by introducing those 2 revolutions. Just out of curiosity, I don't know how many of you are in psychology or a related field. I'm just kind of curious to see. Yeah, so for those who aren't, you may not be as familiar, but I'll kind of give an introduction, and then I'll talk about some sort of areas of convergence, and I'll particularly focus on areas of conflict between these. So some of you are familiar with the idea of open science, and there's been an open science revolution that was really prompted by the replication crisis. So around 2010 or so, a number of classic findings in psychology were found not to replicate. The sorts of things that you learn about in your introductory psychology book, famous studies in social psychology in particular, whole subfields were found to kind of be built on sand, houses of cards. And so in response to this, a lot of psychologists began to propose different ways of analyzing data, different ways of publishing, all sorts of things. So this was a reaction to the replication crisis, that this sort of revolution had to happen. It was noted that researchers have a very strong confirmation bias, a strong drive to find what they already believe to be true. And so there needs to be a sort of special proactive measures. These are some sort of headlines about the replication crisis, but people may remember this when it sort of happened. I remember as a psychologist, colleagues in other disciplines sort of reading these and saying, isn't everything in psychology wrong? And well, it depends on the subfield, it depends on the area. So in response to this, there were a number of open science reforms. These are just several examples of them. So for instance, pre-registration, researchers would pre-register their studies ahead of time, describing the design of the study, describing their hypotheses, describing their data analytic plan. That way they couldn't, after they get results, change all of those things so that they could claim that their predictions were right in the first place. You have to register, in a sense, your predictions ahead of time. full and open data sharing. If you were analyzing data in a way that was sort of biased towards finding what you wanted to, your data were shared. Other people could reanalyze your data, find different things. Conducting exact replications, because again, the replication crisis was there. And thinking meta-analytically, as we say, not trusting individual studies to give us broad conclusions that are reliable over time. So this has made a great deal of progress. There's been a lot of success towards these sorts of goals. Journals incentivize them, professional associations do. At the same time, particularly in the past 5 years, but again, it goes back further than this, there's been a second revolution that I describe here as social responsiveness. You can think of it as maybe related to social activism. There are specific initiatives within social responsiveness like anti-racism, decolonization, things like that. I'll come back to this slide, but just to show you a few examples from recent journals: How to Become an Anti-Racist Clinician, Anti-Racist Psychology to Advance Equitable Public Policy from the Dangerous Opportunity Policy Team, and within developmental science, How to Advance Scholarship on anti-racism, but I could do the same thing for a lot of other sub-initiatives within social responsiveness. One thing I associate with this revolution is viewing psychologists as policy advocates. So the kind of idea of policy-focused science, I would say, applies to psychology as well, particularly in clinical fields where you can kind of relate your practice to something that would be like science. And so the idea is you have this social responsibility to do research that would show certain things. If we already know what is right in terms of policy, you want to find scientific research that will help promote those policy goals. And there are some other associated initiatives within this, like increasing diverse representation in the field on typical demographic variables, not viewpoint diversity or things like that. So at the same time as open science has been progressing, we see the social responsiveness. So I began to get interested really in 2020 because I was surprised to see calls for papers that were really very social activism focused that seemed to go against a lot of open science ideas. But first, before I talk about those conflicts in greater detail, I should acknowledge there are some convergences between these two movements. So first of all, a lot of psychological associations endorse both of them. If you look just at the American Psychological Association, they have a lot of initiatives around open science. APA journals do a lot around that, but they also do a lot of social policy focused, social activism focused things. The APA petitions the Supreme Court when there's a case that relates to anything that could be construed as related to psychology. So any social or political case that you could claim psychology research has a bearing on. So social responsiveness and open science are endorsed by these societies. They also both have an interest in terms of how bias can harm science. They both are concerned about science being exclusionary in some way that might prevent us from tracking truth well. So at least in theory, there are some convergences there. Even open access to data, you could say, would allow science to be more equitable for folks who don't have the capital to amass large data by themselves and things like that. So I do acknowledge there are certainly areas of convergence, but I'm much more interested in the areas of conflict. So I'll be talking about these three areas, but first I'll just briefly note them. First of all, if our goal is to promote particular social and political changes that we know ahead of time that we want, open science might actually undermine those goals. You might find results that actually go against whatever social policy you're trying to promote. Second, open science advocates for equal and fairly narrow rules for everyone to follow, whereas socially responsive science tries to kind of make up for perceived biases in how researchers are treated by holding people to different standards, as we'll see. And then finally, open science has a distrust of subjective experiences and your feelings and vibes and all of that as scientific evidence, whereas at least some socially responsive scholars have endorsed that as a basis for science, as we'll see. So just to go into the first conflict, as I say, open science can undermine politically helpful findings, is what I call them. So I'll just take two examples. There are many more I could give, but two from the area of gender. So around 2000, there was an early study showing that the gender gap in math performance might be explained by what social psychologists call stereotype threat. Women are aware of a stereotype that women are bad at math. That makes them more anxious, which then makes them bad at the math task. And so there's no genuine difference in skill. It's the stereotype that actually causes the difference. So this early study kind of found that. Similarly, some of you may be familiar with the famous power pose study from about 10 years later in 2010, where mostly female participants were asked to kind of hold power poses like this, and it was shown in that particular study, it was argued that they had higher levels of testosterone after they did those sorts of things. It was said that by sort of teaching women to engage in power poses, that might lead to gender equity. There were a lot of editorials published about this. It's kind of hard to believe now. There were workshops for women on how to hold power poses. Neither of these studies were shown to replicate. In fact, they were shown not to replicate a number of times. There have been meta-analyses on both of these topics, and pre-registered studies do not find these sorts of phenomena. So both of these findings were sort of politically helpful, at least towards progressive social goals. But sadly, open science undermined them, you could say, by showing that they were not the case. Relatedly, if you do accurate science, like accurate scientific findings do have the potential to do social harm. Some of you may be familiar with this editorial that was widely discussed on social media. The journal Nature Human Behavior published an editorial for any potential contributors with a very ethics-related title, Science Must Respect the Dignity and Rights of All Humans. And they kind of warned potential contributors that their work might not get published or might be retracted or removed after being published if there was content that could reasonably be perceived to undermine the rights or dignities of an individual or group. This is sort of vague. It's hard to know exactly what it would entail, but if you were doing, for instance, research on gender differences and spatial rotation skills, it's not entirely implausible that that could be taken to undermine the dignity of a group that, did not do as well on those sorts of tasks. So perhaps that research wouldn't get published, or if it did get published, it would be retracted if someone said, I think that undermines someone's dignity, and if that was taken to be a reasonable claim. So just to take a sort of extreme example of how socially harmful research might be censored, some of you may have seen this article, I think it was back in October or November, a sort of top researcher in the area of trans children's health very openly said, we're not going to be publishing data from this study. Basically, this was a study of puberty blockers, and it was shown in the early data, at least, that there was no benefit to children's mental health by taking puberty blockers. And so the researcher was very open, just sort of saying this research would be weaponized against trans children and being able to at least use puberty blockers. And the researcher was almost certainly correct. It would not be unreasonable for policy advocates who are against giving puberty blockers to children to say, look at this data, this is not supportive of this, we shouldn't do that. So you can call it weaponization, but it's very reasonable to think that policy advocates would use the research when they're kind of arguing for or against policies. So the researcher was certainly correct. The implication would be then that you should be censoring or self-censoring research if it goes against these social goals. So this is, of course, very against the open science idea, right? I mean, if we want research to be publishable, if we want meta-analytic thinking so that we can get a general sense of what's true and false, and I think this sort of first area of conflict boils down to the fact that open science judges research based on methodology, whereas socially responsive science judges research based on results, whether you're finding results that are socially and politically helpful. So these are two very different ways of thinking about science, and I think that first conflict really highlights that. The second area of conflict I'll talk about is, again, this sort of difference between holding everyone to the same standards and trying to make up for perceived societal biases. So should we sort of make universal interventions on science, or should we target them towards particular groups? Should reforms be for everyone? Should we be encouraging certain types of work by certain types of people to make up for societal biases in the opposite direction? So open science advocates, again, tend to have very high standards for what research should look like, and they apply those standards to everyone. Socially responsive researchers have actually argued that some folks should be able to avoid these open science standards. So for instance, one scholar, and there have been a number of others, who have argued that if you do qualitative research that doesn't involve quantitative data analysis, that open science doesn't really apply to you. Bennett, for instance, argued that qualitative researchers don't have hypotheses, so there's no reason to pre-register anything. It's hard to believe there are researchers who don't have expectations about how their results might turn out. And if you've read qualitative research, there often is, but that has been sort of argued. Torres et al. Argued that open science standards would be weaponized against scholars of color who may not be able to amass as large sample sizes and things like that. There was an article in American Psychologist, APA's flagship journal, by the folks who you see in the last bullet here, arguing that sort of traditional standards for what counts as top methodology actually discriminate against researchers who are doing transformative, socially engaged psychology. So again, there's a conflict here. If you want to sort of have one goal, then it doesn't work too well with the other one. As I say, part of this conflict is also a drive to proactively encourage certain types of work by certain types of people. I'm a trained school psychologist, so I'm going to give a couple examples from that literature, but the Journal of School Psychology had a call recently for papers on contexts in which policies have negatively and disproportionately impacted minoritized children and families. Not an unreasonable goal if you think about it superficially, but let's say that you conduct a study and you find that a particular policy actually benefited minoritized children and families. That issue wouldn't be appropriate for your study, apparently. Based on the results, it actually wouldn't fit that call for papers. So we're actually kind of deliberately biasing what that estimate is in terms of, what things are with a policy, because research in a certain direction isn't going to get published, and they're being open about that from the start. The Journal of Psychology and Neuroscience went even further. There was actually a call for papers on women in neuroscience. I got interested because I study history of psychology, and I thought maybe I would even send in a paper about perhaps a famous pioneer who's a woman in neuroscience, but I couldn't, as it turned out, because it was a call for papers not about women in the field of neuroscience as sort of historical subjects, but the first author of the paper had to be a woman to submit to it, which was sort of interesting. And the journal School Psychology, the APA journal School Psychology, all special issue calls for papers have to incorporate social justice in the call. Again, it's not, social justice is an important thing in many ways, but it's just interesting in terms of the sort of slant towards what's encouraged, what's being called for in terms of research. So we see this, it's not a sort of equal opportunity playing field, or so it seems. Socially responsive researchers argue that the reason why you need these sorts of initiatives is that we're compensating for biases that are already there. So if there's already a bias towards one direction, we need these sorts of proactive attempts in the other. It's sort of like an affirmative action position. You sort of have to correct for past and current biases by deliberately encouraging, stimulating certain work. I think the compensation thesis has a number of issues, though. It's not always clear how much compensation is needed, and it's not always clear whether biases that are present in society at large are also present in the same direction or to the same degree in academic psychology or in professional psychology, and that's where we're trying to correct for them. So I'm gonna, just because of time, skip over a bit and get to conflict number 3. How much should we trust people's subjective experiences? The tweet that you see here is from an open science advocate, Michael Frank, a developmental psychologist. He's talking about the open science movement here. He says the core of this movement is the idea of nullius in verba. That was the motto of the Royal Society. Take no one's word for it. The distinguishing feature of science on this account is the ability to verify claims. Science is independent of the scientist and subject to skeptical inquiry. So open science folks tend to sort of adopt the sociologist Robert Merton's norm of organized skepticism as an element of science. A lot of socially responsive scholars find that to be kind of mean. In fact, there's even a discussion, not only on social media, but there was even an article published about bropen science, bros, men who are aggressive, who use open science to sort of aggressively critique others' work. So socially responsive science instead tends to emphasize trust and deference, particularly to researchers or participants who come from marginalized groups. An example of that, an example of highlighting that deference, is the advocacy of positionality statements by socially responsive scholars. So this is something that a number of journals, even some top journals, are now requiring or encouraging, that researchers give positionality statements. The idea derives from a sort of standpoint epistemology, as it's called, in philosophy of science, where kind of everyone is coming from a different standpoint. You want to make clear what background you're coming from. And there's no doubt some truth to that. The idea, though, kind of very quickly bleeds into the implication that your results should be trusted or not based on who you are, and often that means demographically. Positionality statements are not where people are talking about how I have X years of experience doing this research or anything like that. Instead, it's based on people's demographic features. So let's see. Yeah, this is just an example of one article from the Journal of Counseling Psychology recently, a positionality statement about one of the folks there. So it tends to be based on demographic features that people are giving their sort of trust about, like, based on my demographic features, I have sort of personal relations with this research, and that's thought to be a good thing. Whereas if you think of it like in open science ideas, having personal relations might create a conflict of interest. But in the sort of socially responsive science, that's not the case. So socially responsive scientists also often want to validate their participants' lived experiences, particularly, again, when they're studying folks from minoritized groups or marginalized groups. Now, subjective experience is obviously core to psychology. It's sort of psychologists' stock in trade. But traditional psychology and open science psychology doesn't endorse people's subjective experiences. In fact, it may study whether or not they're correct. Just to give a simple example, the Mueller-Lyer illusion that you've all seen, to at least, most everyone, it looks as though the bottom line is longer than the top line. Your subjective lived experience is that the lines are different in length. But we know they're not. It's important, and it tells us interesting things about our perceptual system, that we have inaccurate subjective experiences. But that's not something that works well with socially responsive scientists' ideas about trust and deference. So what to do about these conflicts? If you look back historically, again, a lot of my interests are in the history of psychology, you don't find that this is a new conflict between objectivity and social activism in psychology. Just to take one interesting historical parallel, the perception researcher James J. Gibson, all the way back in 1940, had published the results of a survey of psychologists who were interested in social activities. SPSSI is the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues. They formed during the Great Depression to study social issues. They exist today. They're kind of more activist-oriented psychologists. And when they were surveyed back then, it was interesting. The survey was about whether SPSSI should make partisan policy statements. And Gibson summarized the results of the study on this point. Says the more general feeling was that a paradox is involved in the opposition of objectivity to progressive partisanship, which needs to be resolved. Upholders of scientific detachment do not like to be classified as conservatives, and equally the progressives do not like to be classed as lacking in objectivity. And it's amazing, this is now like 85 years later, very, very similar, I think, if you look at the sort of landscape in psychology. So what to do? First of all, I think we need to acknowledge these conflicts. We need to acknowledge value conflicts. Value conflicts are not unusual in everyday life. We need to be transparent about these sorts of trade-offs, and researchers and associations should be clear about their positions on them in terms of where they draw lines and what to do. Personally, I also find it helpful to be humble or even entirely agnostic about the truth of empirical questions when you're concerned that political biases are biasing the conclusions of an area of literature. I try not to endorse in my teaching or research what I would call the party line when I'm concerned about a particular research base being politically biased. And this is perhaps more personal, but also I think everyone can benefit from studying the history and philosophy of science and looking for the historical parallels in their fields, examining the literature. There are a lot of very bright people in philosophy of science who study the role of social values in science, and I think it really helps to inform our thinking about those things. So very much appreciate your attention and interest. So thanks. Awesome. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Please. Yeah. Oh, thank you. No. No.
I would just add one thing in case and see if you agree with it.
Mm-hmm.
One, this analogy is open science affected all of psychology. What you do, neuroscience, cognitive psychology, developmental. The socially engaged work really exists, and you get it right. But it seems to affect more sort of small circles of psychology. Someone who studies visual perception or mathematical representation of the brain could never encounter their entire career.
Could never encounter.
Never encounter socially engaged.
It's a good question. So I think so the claim was, that open science potentially applies to all areas of psychology, whereas socially responsive science sort of only applies to some areas. I would disagree with that. I think there are strong desires right now for everyone, every science, to be involved in socially responsive goals. So I think that, there's a drive to find some way to bring it into your area. So if you're a visual perception researcher, then perhaps you're going to be focused on increasing demographic representation among visual perception researchers in your professional association. And that would still be part of the socially responsive science goal. Or maybe you'll study cultural differences in visual perception. You may be familiar with some recent controversies about to what degree culture plays a role in people's experience of visual illusions, the Mueller-Lyer illusion, in fact. So I think there's a drive to do that, but I would agree with you that it's asymmetrical, or there are certain areas that are more affected, or affected in some ways. The second half of the introductory psychology book. But what I feel like I've seen over the past decade or so, and maybe even longer, is that student interest and the field interest and the public sort of PR of psychology has focused more on that second half of the intro book. Social, developmental, clinical, things that were more core to psychology, like sensation and perception, are not so much today in its representation. But I'd be curious. Yeah, please.
I agree with a lot of that, but you seem to be conflating two things. One is the desire for diversity for social, political, reasons. Another one is there's often a movement in psychology to get away from studying so-called weird populations, Western educated, Western democracy, to do better science. So the Mueller-Lyer illusion debate with Firestone and Ramirez paper is just saying we study broad samples. We'll learn a lot more about the visual perception systems. I would put a desire for diversity in subjects as just good science and not social behavior.
I would agree with you. I mean, I think there are a lot of initiatives within socially responsive science. I'm much more sympathetic. I'm sympathetic to all of them to some degree, but much more to some than others. I would agree. Yeah, please.
Terrific talk.
Thank you.
Follow-up to that question is that I think it even exists in basic sciences. I mean, I think that I see it in my field of this postmodernism that it is what we want to think it is, and that exists on the most basic levels of science.
I think that, I appreciate it very much. James Gibson, who you saw there, was not only an officer of SPSSI, but he was a perception researcher. He didn't do anything in social or clinical psychology or anything like that. And it's kind of fascinating to look at the history of that sort of activist subgroup of APA folks, because they really often were empirical scientists who wanted to nonetheless find a way to be involved in social and political change. Please.
I believe in the White House budget request. The only area of NSF research that saw its funding go up was behavioral science.
Interesting.
In light of your talk, why do you think it is?
I didn't know that. So the claim that if funding for behavioral science went up, but other areas went down.
Especially physics, weirdly.
Interesting. So one thing I would point out, for folks who are concerned about the replication crisis, especially if you're from a different area other than psychology, fields other than psychology have had, my understanding is similar issues with replication. I'm not sure that psychology is any worse or anything like that. And as I think the climate science talk illustrated, the incentives for publishing and making claims may not be appreciably different in other fields than psychology. So, but I'm not sure why the White House has a particular interest in psychology. I never, like a gift horse in the mouth, but it's an interesting, but appreciate it. So thanks very much. Thank you again.
All right. And last up, we have Anthony HAYNOR, Associate Professor of Sociology at Seton Hall University, and he's going to be talking about, does privileging liberationist sociology constitute pedagogical malpractice? So welcome, Anthony.
When I was trained in sociology at Brooklyn College, I don't recall the field being that politicized. There were plural viewpoints and perspectives. And when I was trained at Rutgers University for my master's and doctorate, I didn't see the field through that political lens. So after having taught sociology for many decades, I realize more and more how important it is to present students with an accurate and comprehensive history of the field. My sense is that sociology students today are not getting an accurate and comprehensive history of the field. And then, I guess I was trying to be provocative. I I believe that it is pedagogical malpractice to not present an accurate and comprehensive history of the field. But this is what has been happening in the discipline of sociology. From my perspective, sociology is an intellectual and, yes, moral discipline that should be viewed as a three-legged stool concerned with three main concepts, but also, in a sense, moral principles: community, integration, and equality, and how they interrelate in very complex ways. So I'm going to go through the three pillars very briefly, but leave most of the time to the case studies that we took up in class, and in an effort to apply these frames to concrete social issues and phenomena. So, community, some of these names may ring a bell with some of you, but certainly Durkheim, Jonathan Haidt talks a lot about Durkheim, the importance of community, that we're social beings. De Tocqueville talked about America as a nation of joiners. Tönnies, I don't know if these terms mean anything to you. I'm sure some of you, these transition from Gemeinschaft to Gesellschaft. Does that ring a bell? Bruce Maslish, the historian, actually wrote a book in 1989 called A New Science: The Breakdown of Connections and the Birth of Sociology. So he argued that sociology was deeply embedded in this concern with community and its breakdown as we moved from pre-modern to modern. Other names I can mention very briefly: Edward Shills talked about 1957 article, different types of social ties, primordial, personal, sacred, and civil. Robert Nisbet's a famous writer, The Quest for Community. Robert Bella, Habits of the Heart, 1985. I could go on, Amitai Etzioni. So community is basically concerned with our social bonds, the degree to which they become weakened under modern conditions of life, how they can be strengthened once again. Ideologically, I think the concern with community has historically been associated with conservatism. Moving on to the second frame, integration. This has to do with a concern with how the parts that make up society, how they are integrated with each other, how well integrated they are. Durkheim was concerned with that. Talcott Parsons, I can name other people. So are the parts, do they fit well together? All right, that's a question. All right. Not completely independent from the community issue, but a separate focus of attention within sociology. So the integration frame focuses on adaptation, mutual adaptation. It focuses or emphasizes pluralism, difference, how those differences can be melded together to produce an integrated whole. I would say, and I think there's evidence to support this, that an integration focus ideologically is aligned with liberalism, the liberal social order. Third, we have equality, which has been becoming much more ascendant within the sociological field. And these names I know are familiar to most of you. Marx and Engels, Communist Manifesto, by the way, which I read in Intro to Sociology. at Brooklyn College. C. Wright Mills, The Power Elite, Foucault, Discipline and Punish, Wallerstein, World Systems Analysis, Kendi, How to Be an Anti-Racist, Wilkerson, who's Caste, that's a recent text that's gotten a lot of attention. The equality frame has become the dominant one. If you want to read a good book on the subject, Christian Smith's The Sacred Project of American Sociology, 2014. The equality frame focuses on trying to understand hierarchy and then dismantling those hierarchies, whether based on class, race, gender, or sexuality. Focuses on addressing the oppression of marginalized groups. Ideologically, it's aligned with radicalism as its ideological core. I make the case what we need to do in the spirit of viewpoint diversity, we need to have robust dialogues within sociology, community integration dialogue, community equality dialogue, integration equality dialogue. I don't have the time to unpack all of that here, but I think those are important conversations to have. But the problem is that the community group is not part of it's not part of the sociological crowd. It's sort of been policed out, and to some degree a concern with integration. So those groups or camps need to be revivified in some way, and then hopefully then they can participate in this robust debate with the equality camp. But what I wanted to focus on in the remaining minutes, 2 case studies we considered in my intro class. One was a study by, I think, Josh Syme, Boston College, Bandage, Sort, and Hustle, 2020. This was a qualitative study of emergency medical teams. And it was very interesting how Syme, his dominant frame, although he did talk about integration, didn't really talk that much about community. But he talked a lot about equality and hierarchy. And his main argument, and he's very upfront at the beginning of the study, saying that emergency medical workers are operating downstream. Right? They're dealing with the people, right, who are victims of gun violence, substance abuse. Basically, they're dealing disproportionately with the marginalized groups. We need to address the upstream issues of inequality and oppression and marginalization, which make it necessary for them to be in these critical medical and mental health circumstances. We discussed this book as a class. We actually read it from cover to cover, which is somewhat unusual these days. But I was trying to push my students into saying, well, what is the frame that the author is adopting? Did he ignore or minimize the other frames? Would that have strengthened or enriched his analysis? So we addressed that issue. The second case study had to do with affordable housing in New Jersey suburbs. I don't know if anybody's familiar with the Mount Laurel decision in New Jersey. Set-asides. The legislature, I think, strengthened passed legislation that would make more robust the enforcement of the malaural decision. So I had them read up on the malaural decision. Towns are pushing back. There are suits against the state. It's very messy at the moment. But I asked the students to write a paper, their final paper, on this issue from the perspective of the three frames. And it's very interesting now. And then on the day of the final exam, we had oral presentations. But I remember beginning that session saying, this is before I read their final papers, I asked them, well, what frame are you most comfortable with? And what do you think was the answer? I think 80% of the class said, no, we prefer the equality frame. So that seemed to resonate most with students. But then I asked them, well, but can a community frame add anything to our understanding of this issue and what to do about it in terms of policies and implementation? Can it, are there serious issues of integration posed by these affordable housing set-asides? Is that possible? So I got them to think in terms of other frames and how those other frames could or should be in dialogue with the equality frame, which they seem to prefer. So I was really trying to push them in the direction of viewpoint diversity within the field of sociology. And I'm hoping to continue work on this and write a history, an interpretive history of sociology using these three frames. I think what's very disturbing to me is that the sociology students now are not getting the history of the field. They're getting a part of it. The equality, the egalitarian emphasis is important. There's a long history of that. I don't mean to minimize that, but it's not the only frame that sociologists should be drawing on. And I think that's what I'm trying to bring to my, not only my intro class, but to all of my sociology courses. So I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for your attention. Well, no, thanks for that comment. That certainly relates to the important distinction between equality of opportunity and equality of results or outcomes. The latter more associated with equity, right? Is that, right, okay.
Thank you. Hi, I'm sociology as well, but you mentioned earlier in terms of what you experience teaching intro, because I like to teach intro, even though everyone runs away from it. I find it fascinating. I'm wondering if there's a selection bias in terms of the student population. Like from my experience, institution where I'm
When you present those other,
During
yeah.
the intro course, we go
Yeah.
over everything. I mean, topics that if you scan Twitter or social media, people are losing their minds over it. We discuss them. BLM, All Lives Matter, and the whole 9 yards. So I'm wondering, but I do know that the student population where I am, there's a healthy share of what you may call conservative students. So I'm not sure if that's
Yes.
your experience.
Oh, I teach at a Catholic university, so we do have some conservative students. But I think I was looking at it more from a pedagogical point of view. Are sociology faculty actually, in most cases, are they presenting these different historical, the various roots of the field? And obviously you're doing it, but I question, I get sort of anecdotal reports from students that it's just sort of one perspective and that's what they're looking for. It's basically a power relations perspective, and they're not really getting it at all. So that was my main focus. But I think if those perspectives were presented, I think students would be receptive, or many of them would be. So. Okay.
Yes, I agree with you. From
Right.
a faculty perspective, I get that feedback. It's a complete groupthink orthodoxy in terms of what is being taught from other faculty in terms of sociology, and that's been happening a lot the past several years. So yes, so I misunderstood. So yes, I agree with you.
Thank you. We'll continue to fight. Any other? Thank you. Really appreciate it.